The year is 1588. The English Channel is filled with the towering sails of the Spanish Armada, the most powerful naval fleet the world has ever seen. King Philip II of Spain has sent an unstoppable force to crush England, overthrow Queen Elizabeth I, and bring the Protestant nation under Catholic rule. England stands on the brink of destruction. Its navy is smaller, outgunned, and outnumbered. The Spanish have more men, more ships, and more firepower. Victory seems inevitable. But then, from the shadows of history, emerges one man, a sailor, a privateer, a pirate, and a warrior. He is bold, ruthless, and fearless. He has spent years raiding Spanish ships, stealing their treasures, and humiliating their empire. His name is Sir Francis Drake. To the English, he is a hero, the man who will turn the tide of war. To the Spanish, he is El Drac, the dragon, the most feared pirate to ever sail the seas. And now, the fate of England rests in his hands. How did a humble sailor rise to become the most feared sea captain in the world? How did a man once branded a pirate become the savior of England? And how did he defeat an empire that seemed invincible? This is the story of Sir Francis Drake, the pirate who saved England. But to understand how he reached this moment, we must go back, to his beginnings, to a time when Spain ruled the seas and England was just another nation trying to survive. Before Sir Francis Drake became a legend, before he was feared by the Spanish and celebrated by the English, he was just a boy growing up in a world dominated by one of the greatest empires in history, the Spanish Empire. Drake was born in 1540, in the small town of Tavistock, Devon, on the southwest coast of England. His family was not wealthy, nor were they powerful. His father, a Protestant preacher, had to flee their home when Catholic uprisings threatened his life. The Drakes moved to Kent, where they lived near the sea, and it was here that young Francis fell in love with the ocean. In the mid-1500s, England was not the great naval power it would later become. Spain ruled the seas. The Spanish controlled vast territories in the New World. Gold and silver flowed into their ports from the mines of South America. Their ships, known as galleons, carried treasures worth fortunes. No other nation dared challenge them. England, by contrast, was weak on the global stage. Queen Elizabeth I had inherited a country that was financially unstable, struggling to compete with Spain's power. The English navy was small, and England had no colonies in the Americas. For Drake, this imbalance was clear. Spain had everything. England had nothing. At a young age, Drake became a sailor, working under his relatives, the Hopkins family, one of England's most prominent trading families. But their business was not ordinary trade. They were involved in privateering and the transatlantic slave trade. It was with the Hopkins fleet that Drake first tasted battle against the Spanish. In 1568, while on a voyage in the Caribbean, the English fleet was ambushed by the Spanish at San Juan de Ulua. The Spanish massacred many of the English sailors. Drake barely escaped with his life. That day, he learned a lesson that would stay with him forever. The Spanish would never show mercy. And so he vowed, neither would he. He returned to England humiliated but determined. He had seen the Spanish ships loaded with gold and silver, and he had seen how they dominated the seas. Drake did not want revenge. He wanted to change history. From this moment on, Drake dedicated himself to one mission, to strike back at Spain, to weaken their empire, and to take what they had stolen from the world. And soon, Queen Elizabeth herself would take notice of his talents. By the early 1570s, Francis Drake was no longer just another sailor. He had transformed into one of the most daring and ambitious privateers in England. He had learned from his near-death experience at San Juan de Ulua, and now, he was ready for revenge. But revenge alone was not enough. Drake wanted more. He wanted gold, power, and the respect of Queen Elizabeth I. And he knew exactly where to get it, from the Spanish Empire. Spain's control over the Americas and the Caribbean had made them the richest nation in the world. Their treasure fleets carried tons of gold and silver from the mines of South America back to Spain. But these fleets had to cross the Atlantic, making them vulnerable to attack. This was where Drake saw his opportunity. He began planning a series of daring raids, striking at the very heart of Spanish wealth, their treasure ships, their ports, and their supply lines. His first major raid came in 1572. Drake and a small crew of 73 men sailed to the Caribbean and targeted the Spanish city of Nombre de Dios in present-day Panama. This city was one of Spain's main treasure hubs, where silver from Peru was stored before being shipped to Europe. It was a fortified city, heavily guarded, but Drake was fearless. He and his men landed in the dead of night, sneaking past the Spanish guards. Then, in a lightning-fast assault, they stormed the city, cutting down Spanish soldiers and reaching the royal treasury. They were so close to seizing millions in silver when Drake was badly wounded in the attack. Bleeding weak and unable to fight, he had no choice but to retreat. His men carried him back to the ship, and they were forced to leave behind the greatest treasure they had ever seen. But Drake was not finished. Even after his near-fatal injury, he refused to leave the Caribbean empty-handed. He gathered local allies, including escaped African slaves known as the Cimarrons, who also hated the Spanish. Together, they planned an even greater heist. Instead of attacking another city, Drake set his sights on a Spanish treasure convoy, a mule train carrying gold and silver through the jungle. In a masterfully executed ambush, Drake and his men struck the convoy, seizing an enormous amount of treasure. This time, there was no last-minute injury, no failed attempt. Drake had won. After months of raiding, he returned to England a rich man and a legend. But Drake's victories in the Caribbean were just the beginning. He had embarrassed Spain, stolen their gold, and humiliated their soldiers. And now, Queen Elizabeth herself was ready to reward him, with a mission that would make him immortal. By 1577, Drake had proven himself as one of the greatest privateers in England. He had fought the Spanish, raided their ports, and made himself a fortune. But now, he was about to embark on his most daring mission yet, a journey that would take him around the world. For years, Spain had claimed the Pacific Ocean as their own, believing that no other European power could challenge them there. They used it as a safe trade route, shipping massive amounts of gold and silver up the coast of South America before sending it across to Spain. But Queen Elizabeth wanted to change that. She secretly commissioned Francis Drake to do the impossible, sail into the Pacific and raid Spain's most valuable cities and ships. This was not just piracy, this was a declaration of war. Drake set sail with 5 ships and 164 men, heading west across the Atlantic. But before he could even reach the Pacific, disaster struck. The voyage was plagued by terrible storms, infighting and treacherous conditions. One ship was lost in a storm, another turned back, and by the time Drake finally reached the southern tip of South America, only one ship remained, his flagship, the Golden Hind. It was here, at the most dangerous waters in the world, the Strait of Magellan, that Drake faced his greatest test yet. The passage was narrow, filled with violent waves, deadly rocks and unpredictable winds. No English sailor had ever navigated it successfully. Many had tried. Most had died. Drake pushed forward. For weeks, his crew battled against the elements, desperately trying to reach the Pacific. When they finally emerged on the other side, they were exhausted, but victorious. They had done what no Englishman had ever done before. But there was no time to celebrate. Because now, they were in enemy waters, and it was time to attack. Drake had made it to the Pacific, but now came the true test, striking at the heart of Spain's power. The raids that followed would shake the Spanish Empire to its core. Francis Drake had done the impossible. He had navigated the Strait of Magellan, reaching the Pacific Ocean, Spain's most prized and protected waters. No Englishman had ever sailed these seas before. To Spain, the Pacific was theirs. It was a safe trade route, where their treasure-laden ships moved without fear of attack. Until now. Drake and his crew, now sailing on the Golden Hind, had one mission, to raid Spain's richest ports and ships, to strike at the heart of their empire, and to take their gold. The first target? The Spanish treasure fleet. Spain's ships carried millions in gold and silver from their colonies, but they had no reason to expect an English ship in the Pacific. Drake moved like a ghost, striking before his enemies even knew he was there. Off the coast of Chile, he captured his first Spanish vessel, a small but wealthy ship carrying gold and valuable supplies. Then in Peru, he raided Callao, one of the richest ports in the region. But his greatest prize was still ahead, a single Spanish galleon known as the Cacafuego. This ship was one of the most valuable in the world, carrying an enormous load of treasure. Drake pursued it for days, racing across the Pacific, closing in on his target. Then, in a swift and brutal ambush, the Golden Hind struck. Drake's men fired grappling hooks, boarding the Spanish ship before the crew even had a chance to fight back. In minutes, the battle was over.
And the treasure? Unimaginable.
With one attack, Drake had captured a fortune beyond belief. But now, there was a problem. How would he get back to England without being caught by the Spanish? The chase was on. Francis Drake and his crew stood on the deck of the Golden Hind, surrounded by tons of gold, silver, and jewels. They had just stolen one of the richest treasures Spain had ever transported. But now, they faced an even greater challenge: getting home alive. Drake knew that the entire Spanish fleet would soon be hunting him. If he tried to sail back through the Strait of Magellan, he would be caught and executed. So he made a bold decision, one that would make history. Instead of turning back, Drake kept sailing west. He continued across the Pacific, landing in the Philippines, where his crew restocked supplies and repaired their ship. Then, he sailed to Indonesia, trading with local rulers and gathering more wealth. Finally, in 1579, he set course for home, not through the Atlantic, but around the entire world. It was a treacherous journey, filled with storms, disease, and constant fear of capture. But after nearly 3 years at sea, the Golden Hind finally arrived back in England in 1580. Drake had circumnavigated the globe. He had stolen millions from Spain, humiliated their empire, and made himself one of the richest men in England. But his greatest test was still ahead. The Spanish Armada was coming. Francis Drake had done the unthinkable. He had circumnavigated the globe, raided Spanish ports in the Pacific, and stolen millions in gold and silver from Spain's greatest treasure fleets. When he returned to England in 1580, he was a legend. But his success came at a price. Spain was furious. King Philip II, ruler of the Spanish Empire, demanded his execution. To Spain, Drake was not a hero. He was a criminal, a pirate, and a traitor to international law. But in England, he was welcomed as a national hero. The people of England celebrated his return, and Queen Elizabeth I herself came aboard the Golden Hind to personally greet him. Then, in an act that sent shockwaves across Europe, Elizabeth knighted Drake on the deck of his ship. For Spain, this was an insult beyond measure. Drake's private raids had always been deniable. The English crown had never officially admitted to backing him.
But now?
Elizabeth had publicly honored him. This was not just a gesture. It was a declaration of war. And Philip II would not let it go unanswered. Philip II was already planning his revenge. He would build the greatest naval fleet in history, an armada powerful enough to crush England forever. And when the time came, Drake would have to fight, not as a pirate, but as England's greatest admiral. The Spanish Empire had been the most powerful force in the world for nearly a century. They had conquered entire continents, built vast cities, and controlled an oceanic trade network that spanned the globe. But Francis Drake had humiliated them. He had raided their richest cities, burned their ships, and stolen their gold. And now, Spain wanted revenge. King Philip II began planning his greatest attack yet, a fleet so powerful, so unstoppable, that it would crush England once and for all. This fleet would be called the Spanish Armada. Philip II began constructing over 130 warships, filling them with 25,000 soldiers and sailors. The Armada would sail to England, land thousands of troops, and overthrow Queen Elizabeth. But Drake was not going to wait for them to attack. In 1587, a year before the Armada was ready, Drake launched a preemptive strike, an attack that would change history. Francis Drake had spent years preparing for this moment. He had raided the Spanish, stolen their gold, humiliated their fleets, and now, Spain was coming for revenge. King Philip II of Spain had assembled the most powerful naval force in history, the Spanish Armada. This fleet was not just for battle, it was for conquest. Philip II's goal was not just to defeat England, but to invade it, overthrow Queen Elizabeth, and restore Catholic rule. This would not be just another war. This would be the end of England as an independent nation. The Armada was massive, 130 warships, over 25,000 men, and enough firepower to flatten any navy that stood in its way. But Spain made one fatal mistake: they underestimated Drake. In April 1587, just 1 year before the Armada was set to launch, Drake took the fight directly to Spain. Instead of waiting for the invasion, he launched a preemptive strike on the Spanish port of Cadiz, where much of the Armada's fleet was being assembled. This attack was later called the singeing of the King of Spain's beard. Under the cover of night, Drake and his fleet sailed into the heavily guarded Spanish port and unleashed chaos. They set fire to over 30 Spanish ships, destroyed tons of supplies, and delayed the Armada's invasion by nearly a year. This attack was a major blow to Spain's war plans. But despite this setback, the Spanish Armada was still coming. And in 1588, England would face its greatest battle yet. In July 1588, the Spanish Armada finally set sail for England. It was an unstoppable force, an armada larger than anything England had ever faced. For Philip II, this was destiny. For Elizabeth I, this was survival. And for Francis Drake, this was his greatest test. The English navy was outnumbered and outgunned. But they had one advantage: Drake's tactics. He did not fight Spain's way, he fought his way. Instead of meeting the Armada in a direct naval battle, the English navy used speed and maneuverability. Drake's plan was simple but effective: hit and run, disrupt supply lines, and never let the Armada land. Then came the Battle of Gravelines. Drake launched fire ships, old burning vessels that were sent directly into the Spanish fleet. In the chaos, the English navy attacked relentlessly, using their lighter, faster ships to outmaneuver the giant Spanish galleons. The Spanish were trapped. The battle was brutal, and the Armada was shattered. Then, nature finished the job. A massive storm, later called the Protestant wind, scattered what remained of the Spanish fleet. Many ships sank, others crashed against the shores of Scotland and Ireland, and by the time the survivors limped back to Spain, over half the Armada was gone. England had won the greatest naval battle in its history. And Francis Drake? He was now a living legend. The defeat of the Armada was not just a military victory, it was a turning point in world history. It marked the rise of England as a global naval power and the beginning of Spain's decline. And at the heart of it all was one man, Sir Francis Drake, the pirate who saved England. England had stood against the mightiest empire in the world, and won. The Spanish Armada had been crippled, its once invincible fleet shattered by Drake's cunning, Elizabeth's leadership, and England's fierce resistance. This battle was more than just a naval victory, it was a turning point in history. For the first time, Spain's dominance had been challenged. The once unstoppable empire was now weakened, and England was beginning to rise as a new naval superpower. At the center of it all stood Sir Francis Drake. To England, he was a hero, the man who had sailed the world, stolen Spain's gold, and led the charge against the Armada. To Spain, he was a thief, a pirate, a criminal who had defied their empire. But what was the truth? Drake was a man of contradictions. He was a brilliant strategist, but also a ruthless raider. He was a national hero, but also a man who profited from war and destruction. He was a fearless explorer, but also a privateer who took what he wanted. So how should history remember him? Was he a patriot or a pirate? Was he a savior or a thief? Was he England's greatest naval commander, or just a daring outlaw who happened to be on the right side of history? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this story fascinating, wait until you hear about Blackbeard, the most feared pirate of the Caribbean.